think we tend to not see conscious experiences for what they are at a very basic level.
Pleasure, pain, visual or auditory experience, these are all forms of consciousness.
And so we need to consider the brain in the body and in the world.
But I can't change the world by just imagining it to be different. Otherwise, it would be different right now.
I want to start by clearing up a little bit of ambiguity. The word consciousness is a very ambiguous word. Often people use it to mean something quite sophisticated like self-consciousness, awareness of one's own existence. This is something quite sophisticated that we might be reluctant to ascribe to many non-human animals. It's not clear a rabbit is aware of its own existence. But all that I'm going to mean, all that's generally meant in these discussions by the word consciousness, it's probably a little bit of a misleading word, really. All it really means is experience. Pleasure, pain, visual or auditory experience, these are all forms of consciousness. So consciousness in this sense is certainly something where we'd be happy to ascribe quite generally in the animal kingdom. Whether or not a rabbit is aware of its own existence, it certainly has experiences. If you're cruel enough to put a knife in a rabbit, it's going to feel pain. So I don't think it's difficult to define what we mean by consciousness. The challenge, the problem of consciousness is how consciousness fits into our scientific worldview. Despite great progress in our scientific understanding of the brain, we still don't really have even the beginnings of an explanation of how complicated electrochemical signaling is somehow able to give rise to an inner subjective world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us knows every second of waking life. So this is the profound challenge consciousness poses to the sciences. Now, although it's broadly agreed that there is a profound challenge here, one very common reaction is to say, okay, there's a problem, but we just need to plug away with our standards methods of investigating the brain, just do a little bit more neuroscience, maybe cognitive science, and we'll crack it. One thing I'm keen to press in my work as a philosopher of consciousness is, upon reflection, it turns out this isn't just another scientific problem. In many ways, the problem of consciousness is absolutely unique among scientific problems. And in fact, that the standard tools of scientific investigation are not really equipped to deal with it, at least not entirely. There are two traditional options here. On the one hand, dualism, the view that consciousness is non-physical, outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. And on the other hand, materialism, roughly the view that consciousness can be explained in terms of the chemistry of the brain, the electrochemical signalings in the brain. Unfortunately, and this is really why the problem of consciousness is so hard, is that both of these familiar options face quite profound and much discussed challenges. So I'll just give you a taste of the difficulties with these options. So the problem with dualism is that neuroscience seems to show no sign of the impact of an immaterial mind. So although dualists think the mind and the brain are separate, they think they stand in a close causal relationship. If the soul, the immaterial mind, wants the arm to go up, it makes changes in the brain, the arms go up. My material mind wants to express my thoughts as I'm speaking to you, it makes changes in the brain, my lips move, sound comes out. Now, if there was an immaterial mind impacting on the brain every second of waking life, you'd think that would really show up in our neuroscience. There'd be all sorts of things happening in the brain that had no physical explanation. It would be like a poltergeist was playing with the brain. And that's not what we seem to find. I've just finished a popular article for BBC Future. And here's a way I try to explain it there that might be helpful. The relationship between the mind and the brain for a dualist is a bit like the relationship between a drone pilot and his or her drone, right? You receive information from the drone, from the sensors of the drone, and you control it. Similarly, for the dualist, you receive information from your brain and you control your body via your brain. Now, if you were to examine the physical workings of a drone, in principle, you could see where the radio signals come into the drone and the pilot controls it. Similarly, if dualism is true, you'd think by examining the brain, we'd see where the signals are coming in from the immaterial mind. René Descartes, perhaps the most famous dualist in history, hypothesized that it happened in the pineal gland, which is a real P-shaped gland in towards the center of the brain between the two hemispheres. But neuroscience reveals that there isn't really such a special place in the brain. And indeed, everything that happens in the brain seems to be caused by other physical processes in the brain. So it's rather like if we, suppose we found something we thought was a drone, and then we examined it, and we discovered actually everything that it's doing is caused by physical processes within it. Then we draw the conclusion, actually, this isn't a drone at all, it's a robot. Many philosophers and scientists would like to draw something like that conclusion about the human brain. Okay, so these kind of considerations push a lot of people to materialism. What's the problem with materialism? Well, here I think we come back to Galileo. Since Galileo, physical science has worked with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness is an essentially quality-involving phenomenon. If you think about the smell of coffee, the feel of cold ice, the blueness of a blue experience. And as Galileo well understood, you can't capture these kind of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're always going to leave out these qualities and hence leave out consciousness itself. So, I mean, I think the philosophical case against materialism is very compelling, as more and more people are accepting. Why does materialism still continue to be probably just about the most popular option? I think it's because of a certain kind of inference people draw from the history of science. They think, look at the great success of physical science, and explaining more and more of our universe, producing incredible technology. The wonders of technology has this kind of visceral effect on you. And this leads people to think, well, look, of course, it's one day going to explain consciousness. But I think this common reaction is rooted in a misunderstanding of the history of science. Yes, physical science has been incredibly successful, but it's been incredibly successful precisely because Galileo designed it to exclude consciousness. If Galileo were to time travel to the present day and hear about this difficulty of explaining consciousness in the terms of physical science, he'd say, of course you can't do that. I designed physical science to deal with the quantitative, not the qualitative, right? And, the reason it's been so successful is that I gave it this very narrow, focused task. And the fact that it's been very good at dealing with the quantitative doesn't give you grounds to think it's going to be good at dealing with a quite different explanatory task of dealing with these subjective qualities we find in experience.
Well, I think of consciousness as a feature or property of certain mental occurrences, mental episodes, thoughts, feelings, sensations, conscious perceptual experiences. And these are properties ultimately of living organisms, and they are determined by what's going on inside the organism and what's going on outside the organism, some combination of those things. Does that mean that consciousness is physical? Well, here I have to turn into a philosopher and I say, well, I'm sorry, but that depends what you mean by physical. The idea that consciousness might be physical has been tied to the doctrine of physicalism, which is a kind of inheritor of the 17th century notion of materialism, the idea that everything is matter or everything is made of matter. Physicalism says something slightly different because it says that it ties its doctrine to physics and not physical science, so it's physics strictly speaking. I don't think there's any reason to think that consciousness is physical in that sense, that it's physical science that's going to tell us what the nature of consciousness is. I think consciousness is a feature that of the states of living beings and not inanimate beings. Inanimate beings don't have consciousness. I think you have to be living to have consciousness. And I take that to be obvious. I know some people object to this, but people are going to object. So what I want to say is that consciousness is not physical in the sense that physicalism or materialism says that everything is physical. Nonetheless, consciousness is, I think, a property or feature of organisms, which are material objects in the sense that they have material properties and qualities and things like that. Well, that doesn't tell you anything about how to explain consciousness or how to understand it. It's just getting clear on the basic issue of whether you should think consciousness is something physical. I think consciousness is something psychological, and the psychological emerges out of the biological in a way that we don't understand. But that's my appeal to the idea of emergence there is serious, because I think that there are some stages in the evolution of the world and the evolution of organisms where new things genuinely come into existence, and whether or not we can understand how those things came into existence is an open question.
Well, if the question is how far can we understand consciousness from looking at the brain, a brain on its own is not enough. We need a brain. The job of the brain, after all, is to control its body along with the rest of the nervous system. And so we need to consider the brain in the body and in the world. That's definitely the way things are moving within consciousness studies. But I want to pick on a particular problem that I think is very evident in those scientists who are really trying to use neuroscience and brain scans and so on to understand consciousness. Very popular is the idea of looking for the neural correlates of consciousness. And this idea started with Francis Crick back in his famous 1994 book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. You can sum up the astonishing hypothesis as you're just a bunch of neurons, just a pack of neurons. And of course, people don't really like that idea. But he made the very sensible statement that, after all, he'd solved the DNA problem and all that, If you're going to go into a new science, and he thought he could solve the consciousness problem as well, if you're going to go into new science, you start with correlations before moving on to try and understand causes. So, hence started the idea of looking for the neural correlates of consciousness. A classic example in this paradigm is a sort of experiment where you can take people or even other species and have something like, a Necker cube where it flips. You can see it looking this way, or it flips and it looks the other way, or the famous duck rabbit where it's rabbit and duck. And it's impossible for you to see both at once. So the idea would be, well, when I'm conscious of the duck as opposed to the rabbit, what's going on in my brain? Can I do a brain scan or EEG or something like that? And if I could see which bits are changing, I'd have found consciousness, the bit of the brain that gives rise to consciousness. And there have been lots of experiments like that. And they tend to find all different bits of the brain are the answer to what flips when your conscious vision flips, and don't seem to be quite getting to the answer, but they keep looking. I think it's completely the wrong approach because, as Philip has kind of hinted at, it's kind of hidden dualism. The basis here is that the brain gives rise to consciousness. Consciousness is something other than or more than the activity of the brain. So we've got to find consciousness itself and where it is in the brain, which brain processes give rise to it, and so on. Now, dualism just doesn't work, and most people would agree with that, and you've heard something about it already. So this dualistic view goes in line with thinking that the hard problem is real. Again, you've heard about the phrase the hard problem. Also appeared in 1994 when the then young Australian philosopher Dave Chalmers contrasted it with the easy problems, the hard problem of consciousness itself, with the easy problems of perception, learning, memory, and so on. That's the same kind of mindset that makes you look for consciousness itself being generated by the brain and makes people ask, well, when did it arise? What does consciousness do? What's the function? When did it evolve? And so on. I think all of that is completely misguided. And there are alternatives. There's panpsychism, but You may have made it sound like that's one thing, and it's not. There are lots and lots of versions of panpsychism. We may get to some of those. There's illusionism. Now, both Nick and I have chapters in a book called Illusionism, and you refuse to use or don't like using the word illusion. I would say consciousness is a big illusion, in the sense we've got it completely wrong. Right from young childhood, children start to distinguish between living and non-living, thinking and not thinking, conscious and not far behind. It's very natural to us to imagine that I do some things consciously and I others unconsciously. I see some things consciously, some others are subliminal, and so on. And from there to think there are some processes in the brain that are conscious processes and others that are unconscious. It's just so easy to think that way. I think all of that is wrong. I think that consciousness is something we attribute to some parts of what we're doing or some things we see after the fact. We're completely deluded about it. We will, in the end, find some kind of possibly panpsychic, some kind of answer. But I think what we should be doing is looking in the brain and looking in our evolutionary story for what it was that made us so deluded. That we might find. But consciousness itself, I would say, we never will, because there's no such thing.
Might the very distinction between subject and object, conscious experience and the world, be the mistake?
It's a very loaded question. Even the two ways in which you ask the question have two different meanings, right? I think there is a sense in which the distinction between self and world is an empirical fact that is undeniable. So in what sense is that the case? Well, I have some degree of control over the imagery in my imagination, but I can't change the world by just imagining it to be different. Otherwise, it would be different right now. So there is a sense in which that distinction is undeniable. It's an empirical datum of existence. And then you can go down the question, is this, metaphysically speaking, a fundamental distinction, or is this an illusion? We can pursue those paths, but I don't think the core of the problem is whether there is a subject separate from an object. I think the core of the problem are the metaphysical assumptions we make when we talk about a subject, when we talk about a object. What do we mean by these words? To name two examples, a materialist would deny the distinction. And I would agree with the materialist there. I don't think there is any fundamental distinction between subject and object. But a materialist would make that assumption that the objects, the world out there, are exhaustively describable through quantities. In other words, if you come up with the right list of numbers, then you say everything there is to be said about the object. And then, because they don't distinguish the subject from the object, the same has to apply to the subject. So then you face that situation in which my inner life has to be exhaustively describable by a list of numbers. And I know for a fact that it isn't, because my inner life is constituted of qualities, not only quantities. Now, a panpsychist could say, well, I will make a different assumption. I will say that there are fundamental boundaries between the subjectivity inside and the objectivity outside. And I will say that those boundaries are the boundaries of the primary elements of the material world, whatever they might be. So you're basically acknowledging the distinction between object and subject at a fundamental level. But then you run into another problem because of one's metaphysical assumptions. And that is, well, if I have good reason to think I am fundamentally separate from the world out there, then by the same token, the left hemisphere of my brain is fundamentally separate from the right. Actually, by the same token, one neuron is fundamentally separate from the next neuron, one atom from the next, one subatomic particle from the next. And then you have to explain why our inner lives feel unitary, because that's how we experience it, our inner lives. So to summarize and conclude my answer, I don't think the core of the problem is the question, is the subject distinct from the object? Because there is a sense in which it obviously is, and fundamentally it probably is not. But the problem is the metaphysical assumptions we make when we talk about these things.
And Yeah, so let me just briefly say, I guess, that I don't think that in reality, that is at a fundamental level, there is this subject-object dichotomy. I think the notion of subject comes directly out of the illusion of self, which is created by the brain. And I think the experience of self comes largely out of the function of memory, although there are many different types of brain processing at play that I think contribute to this illusion. And so I think we tend to not see conscious experiences for what they are at a very basic level, which I would say is qualia or felt experience that appear in the universe, rather than qualia that appear to a subject in the universe, which I think is an additional and false step and way of seeing things. So the combination of qualia through memory and across time creates this illusion that there's a solid self moving through time that, again, certain conscious experiences are appearing to. But I think that's part of the illusion, and that this illusion contaminates a lot, if not most, of our thinking about consciousness. So in contemplating theories that place consciousness at a fundamental level, which is something I'm very open to and interested in, I consider it to be a red flag when I see the use of subject or the concept of subject embedded in the theory. And that if we're going to consider consciousness as fundamental, I think we need to look at qualia or felt experience, more like bubbles in a pot of boiling water, where consciousness itself is pervasive. So consciousness is the water in that analogy. So I just think it's important to question how we're thinking about or using concepts like subject and self, and privacy is another term that comes up in this context. And to just keep a close eye on how we're using these concepts or how they're guiding, or rather misguiding our thinking.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.